It was early morning in San Francisco, the kind of morning where the city still rubbed sleep from its eyes, and the streets hadn't yet turned noisy. Inside a dimly lit diner, the smell of burnt coffee mingled with the clatter of dishes. A waitress wiped the counter half-heartedly, a radio playing soft jazz in the background. To anyone walking in, it seemed like any ordinary start to an ordinary day. But in the far booth by the window sat a man who didn't belong to ordinary. He wore a brown blazer over a dark shirt, and his piercing eyes scanned everything without moving his head. Clint Eastwood, or as the city knew him, Inspector Harry Callahan, sipped his coffee with the quiet patience of someone who had seen far too much blood spilled before breakfast. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. The cold steel in his stare did the speaking. Then the door slammed open. A jittery man with wild eyes and a cheap pistol stormed in, shouting threats. Two more followed behind him, younger, nervous, amateurs trying to act tough. The air shifted instantly. Screams broke out, forks clattered to the floor, and a pregnant silence took over the room. Everyone froze, except for one man. Harry Callahan didn't flinch. He didn't dive under the table. He didn't raise his hands. He simply stood up. The main thug pointed his gun straight at Harry's chest. "Sit down, old man," he yelled, voice trembling. Harry's lips curled, not into a smile, but into something darker, something dangerous. In that moment, time slowed. The city outside moved on, unaware that inside this diner, life and death danced dangerously close. A waitress whimpered. A customer dropped his wallet. And Harry? He reached inside his coat, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his .44 Magnum like he was just reaching for a napkin. Then came the line, delivered not as a shout, but as a calm, lethal promise. "Go ahead. Make my day." The moment that followed was quiet, too quiet. The kind of stillness that only exists between a threat and its execution. Harry Callahan's .44. Magnum hung heavy in the air, aimed straight at the heart of the man who dared to interrupt his morning coffee. The robber's eyes flicked down to the barrel. He wanted to believe the cop was bluffing. But Harry Callahan didn't bluff. And in that silence, that long, unbearable silence, the room watched as the robber's bravado withered into raw fear. His hands trembled. His voice cracked. And without another word, he made the smartest decision of his short criminal life. He dropped the gun. The clatter of metal against tile broke the spell. His partners followed suit almost instantly, their weapons hitting the ground with twin clinks. A few moments ago, they thought they were in charge. Now, they stood like schoolboys caught cheating, staring at a man who didn't shout, didn't threaten. He just meant it. Harry didn't lower his weapon right away. He held it steady, letting the message sink in. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Then, with a slow breath, he finally slid the gun back into its holster. The diners began to move again, cautiously, as if afraid their motions might somehow reignite the fire. A rookie patrol cop arrived seconds later, breathless, wide-eyed, clearly out of his depth. What happened here? Harry didn't even look at him. He picked up his coffee, now cold, and took a sip. "Just breakfast," he muttered. But inside him, deep beneath the calm exterior, something old and unsettled stirred. Not guilt, not fear, a weariness, a tiredness that went beyond sleepless nights and violent streets. It was the kind of fatigue that came from knowing the world was getting worse, and the burden of stopping it rested on a man who had already given too much of himself to a city that never said thank you. To everyone else, he was a hero. To himself, he was just surviving. Long before he became the man who could stare down a loaded gun without blinking, Harry Callahan was just a beat cop, young, idealistic, and foolish enough to believe that justice was black and white. But decades of blood on the sidewalks and lies in courtrooms had painted his world in shades of gray. He had once loved this city, truly, fiercely. The winding hills of San Francisco, the clang of cable cars, the salty air drifting off the bay. But as the years passed and the criminals got bolder, his love turned into something colder, a duty, a burden. Somewhere along the way, justice stopped being about law books and started being about survival. He had lost partners, too many, some to bullets, others to bureaucracy. He'd watched as good men were buried with honors, while the politicians who underfunded them gave hollow speeches over their graves. He'd gone home to an empty apartment, poured whiskey into chipped glasses, and stared at case files long after the ink had dried. And through it all, he kept his oath, not because he believed the system worked, but because someone had to stand in the fire when it didn't. The diner incident wasn't the first time he'd faced death. It wouldn't be the last. But what stayed with him that morning wasn't the gunpoint or the surrender. It was the look in the robber's eyes. Not just fear, but recognition. The kind of look that said, this man isn't bluffing. This man would pull the trigger. Because Harry had pulled the trigger before, and every time he did, a piece of him chipped away. There were times when he thought about leaving, about walking away from the badge, the endless reports, the never-ending parade of broken people trying to break others. But he knew he couldn't. Because deep down, he feared what this city would become without men like him. Men who didn't run. Men who didn't fold. Men who didn't pretend evil could always be reasoned with. And so he stayed, year after year. Coffee after coffee. Crime scene after crime scene. Some cops wore their badge with pride. Harry wore his like armor. Because when the city went to sleep, someone had to watch the shadows. And if that meant being the man who others feared, then so be it. Go ahead, make my day, wasn't just a threat. It was a tired man's last line of defense, not against criminals, but against a world that had long since stopped making sense. The report was filed. The suspects were booked, another line in the ever-growing list of cases Harry Callahan had handled. On the surface, it was a successful stop. No shots fired, no lives lost. His captain patted him on the back with a half-smile and said the usual, "Good work, Callahan," as if that phrase had any meaning left after all these years. But what no one ever saw, what no one ever wanted to see, was the weight Harry carried home with him after each encounter. Back in his apartment, he sat in the dark, his coat still damp from the morning rain. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. No family photos, no framed commendations. Just four walls, a chair, and the weight of silence pressing down like a slow, invisible hand. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed at the edges. Inside were two things: a photo of his late wife, and a letter she'd written him before she passed. He hadn't read it in years, not because he didn't want to, but because he already knew every word by heart. It was filled with hope, hope that one day he'd leave the job behind, find peace, maybe even forgive himself for all the things he had done, and all the things he hadn't. But Harry knew better. Men like him didn't retire. They faded out, alone, quietly, like cigarette smoke curling into the air, disappearing without a sound. That night, as he looked out the window at the city lights flickering below, he wondered how many criminals he'd stopped, how many lines had been crossed, how many men had stared into the same barrel that confronted the robber at the diner. And most of all, he wondered if he had changed, or if the world had. He never intended to become a symbol, but somehow that one line, "Go ahead, make my day," became his legacy. A phrase echoed in films, politics, and pop culture. To the public, it was iconic. To him, it was just another mask he wore to keep people from seeing the man behind the gun. He didn't hate what he did. He hated that it was necessary. But when the city cried out for help, it wasn't the system that answered. It wasn't the politicians or the press or the public. It was him. Always him. And so he stayed ready, one hand on the truth, the other on the trigger. Because when the day comes, when another lost soul walks into a diner thinking he owns the world, someone has to be there to say the words. Try it. Days passed. The news ran a 2-minute segment about the diner incident, painting Harry Callahan as the tough-as-nails cop who saved the day with nothing but nerve and a gun. The city loved the story. It made them feel safe, made them believe someone was still out there standing between them and chaos. But Harry didn't watch the news. He sat in the same booth at the same diner, days later, sipping coffee that still tasted like burnt beans and bad memories. The waitress, now a little less shaken, gave him a quiet nod of respect. She didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't need to. People didn't talk much to Harry. They looked, they whispered, sometimes they stared, but they didn't ask questions. Not anymore. Because when a man becomes legend, people stop asking who he is, and only remember what he did. To them, he was the line between order and anarchy. To himself, he was just a man doing a job nobody else wanted to. As he looked out the window, the city moved around him, fast, loud, indifferent. Teenagers laughed as they skateboarded past. A mother yelled at her son to tie his shoes. A street musician played a rusty saxophone across the road. Life continued, messy and beautiful, in ways Harry couldn't fully connect with anymore. And yet, he was still here, still watching, still waiting. Not for thanks, not for redemption, but for the next time someone walked in thinking the world owed them something, and that no one would stop them. Because that's when men like Harry stand up. Not with speeches, not with protests, but with presence. The kind of presence that fills a room like a loaded gun and reminds everyone that actions have consequences. That there are still a few men left who don't look away when things get ugly. He might not smile often. He might not sleep well. But when that door slams open again, when that moment comes, he'll be ready, just like before. And someone, somewhere, will hear the words again. Go ahead, make my day. Not just a threat, a promise.